Hello, everyone. I'd like to talk to you today about insights I've been learning concerning brain theory. I've been getting my information from Dr. Jim Wilder, a clinical psychologist, and Dr. Caroline Leaf, an expert in neuroplasticity. It's about emotional relationships between students and teachers. We know it's really important, and how much more so in the online environment, but actually more than I realized when I've discovered how the brain operates. There are 5 parts of the brain, and information comes into the body and first travels at the back part of the brain, up through the back cortex, and then around to the right side, and then over to the left side of the brain. And there are 5 parts involved here. What happens, first of all, it'll travel through those unconscious parts of the brain where patterns of trust and attachment and basic responses are laid down. The important one to look at today is the amygdala. An amygdala interprets information as either being good, bad, or scary. Now, if it's scary, what happens is it'll actually shut down information traveling to at least the functional part of the brain. There's a little bit that gets to the emotional part of the brain. And what kicks in are the responses that have been learned in a trauma situation, basically. And that is, you may know already, fight or flight or freeze or fawn or comply is really the better word. Well, this is the great reason why fear has been an effective motivator often, because you can get compliance or at worst freezing and non-opposition when you invoke a traumatic, fearful situation. But what happens there is that there is no learning taking place. And therefore, if you even try to discuss the issue with a student who has been triggered this way, you are wasting your time. You are not getting through to the verbal functional part of the brain. And also, that means that any teaching that you've done to help the student cope in a fearful situation, learning behavior, contracts, waste of time, is not going to change student behavior because they can't access that part of the brain. That brain's shut off from them. What has to happen here is counseling or inner healing, because the amygdala has determined responses about what is scary. And if it's not really a scary situation, then that has to be dealt with in a very therapeutic way, but not just talking about it. It has to be really healed in a very intentional way. All you can do in that time is recognize what's happened. Don't blame yourself or be part of yourself. I mean, you do check that you haven't caused a traumatic situation. Don't do that because that will trigger the student. But if you've actually provided a safe environment and you see a student responding in a trauma-based way, know that it is an issue that's going on with them and they cannot help it in that moment. And the best thing you to do is to respond in a compassionate way and be as peaceful as you can, and don't try and escalate or confront the situation, which will only make matters worse. Now, the second type of information that can come into the brain and interpreted by the amygdala is this situation is bad, emotionally bad. And that information will go to the emotional part of the brain, the right side of the brain. And there are 6 receptors there that are all negative based. And it can be processed in any one of those ways. It'll be sadness or anger, disgust, despair. And if that happens, then there is a huge emotional activity going on in the right side of the brain. But this will now turn off or at least impede what's called the relational circuits that opens up to the left side of the brain. And therefore, brain activity will not be great going to the left side. You've got a person, a student in your classroom who's suffering a negative emotional situation, and they're not going to be learning well. They're going to have very low activity in the functional, verbal, analytical, logical part of the brain. And this is observable science. So if a student is feeling unsafe, they think the situation is bad, maybe not scary, but if it's emotionally negative, then what's going to be happening to that student is low left brain functional activity. And therefore, it's bad for education. It's bad for learning. Now, again, just like a scary situation, this may not be your fault. Again, recognize that the student is actually not determining to shut off their left brain. They just can't think well. So be compassionate, be sympathetic. Know it's not their true self. And indeed, there's got to be inner healing or counseling to deal with those wounds in the heart that's interpreting information that may not really be bad. Maybe it's a good environment, or of course, a situation from home, as we know, or whatever else is going on at school. All of these things are very, very difficult and impact the negativity, having nothing to do with you. Now, finally, there is some good ways to turn on the brain. The joy part of the brain is what actually lights up the left side of the brain, and I'll talk about that in my next video. Happy teaching.